All right, good afternoon. Thank you all for coming to this event on the Italian political and economic outlook. I'm going to keep it short. We're going to hear from our four expert panelists, Alberto Alessina, Michele Boldrin, Eric Jones, and my colleague Des Lockman. They're going to give us their view on Italy and its near future. After that, I'll let them attack each other. Ask them a few questions, then we'll turn to audience Q&A. Just so you know, this event is live streamed, so there will be video material. If you ask questions that are not really questions, but more like meandering essays, and that video material can be held against you by friends and family. With that, I think I'm going to give people 45 more seconds to sit down, and I'm going to ask Alberto to start our conversation on the state of Italian politics and Italy's economy and its impact for the Eurozone and for the European Union. Alberto, you want to go ahead?
Thank you for inviting me. So since I'm going first, I thought what I will sketch a few scenarios that may occur, and then let as a start of the conversation to see what people think that is more likely to happen or not to happen. Well, first of all, there's of course a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen, which new government is going to be, whether there's going to be new election or not. But the most likely outcome so far, unless there are new elections, and then who knows what happens, is some sort of government between the Five-Star Movement and the center-right, or at least part of the center-right, the Lega Nord. So I thought I sketched sort of three scenarios. The first scenario, which I think has low probability, which is sort of the horrible one, is that the government, the Lega, and the Five-Star Movement, they implement what they promised during the campaign, like the so-called reddito di cittadinanza, namely the minimum income for everybody, which would be quite general. It has been estimated to cost about 29 billion euros. Pharaonic infrastructure for about 10 billion euro a year for a while. The flat tax between 15 and 23%, which would imply pretty serious reduction in fiscal revenues. Now, in October, if they produce a budget that way, of this kind, the financial market may start to panic. We may get interest rates skyrocketing, like it happened in 2011. The EU would not accept such a budget, therefore making the financial market even more worried. And at this point, what happens, Salvini, the leader of the Lega, may took the opportunity to say, see, they want to force on us another troika like they did with Greece, and take the opportunity to ask for a referendum to leave the euro, and perhaps leave the euro, if not even the EU. And if that happens, let's not elaborate on that, but we could imagine let's just stop there. Now, at that point, I mean, the other alternative to this would be that that the Five-Star Movement may say, no, forget it, let's put a wealth tax to avoid this problem. And they've been talking during the campaign every once in a while about the wealth tax. And the wealth tax in Italy is somewhat complicated from this point of view, because a very large portion, like more than 80% of the wealth in Italy, is real estate. And so wealth tax would be a tax, a lot of it would be on real estate. And there is actually a lot of estate that is not recorded. It's essentially a lot of tax evasion on real estate, much more in the south than in the north. So the wealth tax would be a tax mostly on the north, and the Lega would oppose that, presumably, and so we are back to exiting the EU and so on. Now, some people say that the EU, that I think our friend Luigi Zingales has wrote that Italy is too big to fail, and therefore the EU should have somehow to acquiesce some of the demand from Italy. But if these two parties really do what they promised, I mean, there is no way that the EU can acquiesce to such deficit. Now, the second scenario, which I think it has a higher probability, is that they don't implement what they promised, at least not so aggressively. They do something more moderate one way or the other, and they manage to get the EU to go along with them for a while. But then what I'm worried about is that when there's going to be the next worldwide recession, that sooner or later we will have a recession. There are business cycles, as we know, and sooner or later there will be a recession. At that point, the debt of Italy will not have gone down particularly because they will not have done sort of policies of that kind. So Italy could be the weak link in the euro area, not because they've done something absolutely crazy, but because they have not sort of done adjustment when the things were going reasonably well, and that they let the debt grow even when the economy is growing like it is now. So a financial crisis may be brought by, not so much because Italy did absolutely crazy thing, but because it did not much, and there is a recession in the world. And then we get back to the first point again. What do we do now? Do we have the troika coming in and get out of the euro? And so it's some sort of, we go back to the first horrible scenario, perhaps less dramatically, but there is a risk of what may come in the next recession. The third scenario, which I think is more likely than scenario one, and I'm not sure whether it is more or less likely than scenario two, is that both the Lega and the five-star movement will essentially forget everything they said to the electorate, and they will do essentially nothing, and they will continue to muddle through as always. And so Italy will continue to muddle through with mediocre growth and high debt, and nothing particularly remarkable will happen. You know, we have a precedent in 1994 when Berlusconi was elected the first time. He made these famous contracts with Italy, which he promised incredible things like cutting taxes right and left, and then at the end of the day, he really didn't do much of what he had promised. So it wouldn't be the first time that many promises are disregarded, not only in Italy, but incidentally, but that would be a particular case. So the key to see whether the scenario 3 is going to occur or not is really what you think about the five-star movement. Is the five-star movement becoming sort of a new version of a reasonably moderate left-wing party, perhaps taking, sort of either getting rid completely of the Democratic Party or reaching some agreement or union with part of the Democratic Party, and becoming a sort of a reasonably normal center-left party. I think that is certainly probably part of the five-star leadership would not mind a solution in that direction. And my sense that the other may correct me if I'm wrong, but I have the feeling that part of the Italian so-called intelligentsia, people that would participate in a meeting like this, are beginning to think that, well, perhaps the five-star movement are not so bad, and perhaps that's the only way to move forward, that we should help them and help them in this transition towards becoming a quote-unquote normal party. And in many ways, and at this point they would be right, the five-star movement is a much better candidate to lead Italy than Salvini, who is really, in my view, really we need to be worried about. I'll stop here I may have to say something later about immigration when the issues come up, because of course the success of Salvini comes mostly from the fear of immigrants, and somehow if you take that away, one way or the other with a better policy or better information or whatever. If you take away the sort of fear of immigrant and the share of immigrant in Italy is not higher than in other countries. In fact, it's lower, but the rate of growth has been, after Spain, is the country which has had the fastest rate of growth of immigrants, and that is possibly a short run. The effect of this may be a short run phenomenon that may underscore the appeal of Salvini, but I think we will return to immigration later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's turn to Miguel Abulta. The clicker
Thanks.
works?
Yeah, works perfectly. Thanks for the invitation. Very nice of you to wanting to listen to me, and I'm going to try to make it different, but I have to say that I agree 100% with what Alberto just said, which is useful. So instead of debating, I'll try to add up, and then we'll see if we... And I've used, our hosts were so kind, they sent us 5 questions. The questions were very difficult. So what you will see are just the question, not the answer, because each answer, if one takes it seriously, would have to keep you here for hours. But I agree with what, I think as a background, it's important to stress, I agree with what Alberto said. I actually agree with his implicit, or not so much implicit, ranking of probabilities. I think option 3 is definitely in the card, and everything that we can see in the songs and dance and the particular signaling devices that are used in Roman politics these days, that's where we're going. And unless there is something strange happening within the center-right game, where basically Salvini is trying to pull completely the rug off from under the feet of Berlusconi, the third party, the explicitly fascist party called Fratelli d'Italia, that is led by this. It's irrelevant. I mean, they are an appendix of Lega that takes care of Lazio, where they have a historical rooting. But other than that, they have they don't exist. They don't have any. So the game is between Salvini and Berlusconi. Salvini got the votes now. Berlusconi's got the TVs and the power. You have to understand that Salvini is a product of Berlusconi. Berlusconi made him in the very strict sense that he made the guy a TV star. I mean, he was everywhere. I've never seen anybody in the history of the last 30 years of Italy to be so present in every TV show of every channel, in particular the Berlusconi channels. I mean, day and night. It's like the guy had some form of 3 sosia, so he could be in 3 studios almost simultaneously. And I think that that's the game. So the game is Salvini is asking himself, all right, the dead man walking, I can do without him politically. Every post-electoral poll is saying the 8% that's Berlusconi got would be easily 5 now, because 3 has already decided to vote Lega. But can I do with his vendetta if I cheat and drop him and I go with a 5-star? He's going to unleash his newspapers and TV against me, and that's a problem because I rely on that. And so that's, I think, the name of the game. Other than that, it's clear. And aware of that, the 5-star, which is why I think option 3 is the most, it's really scared of actually having to govern. And the thing that is amazing, if you read the Italian press and the whole debate, is they're almost crying in front of the PD to say, please govern with us, which is, the most ridiculous thing, because it would be like, forgive me, Donald Trump begging Bernie Sanders to come into take the vice president office and also the treasury together. It's pretty much the same thing. But they're doing it, and what they're doing is they're desperately trying to build up a shield from having to govern. Because if you have the PD thing, then they can always say, look, we wanted to do wonders and miracles, but we have to work with these bastards, and it's not working, and that's going to be it. Question, what's the reason? I think Alberto said it. The main reason of the thing is immigration. Immigration, I'll only mention it and I'll let him say more later. I think it's the issue in the short run in Italy that has changed the political scenario in the last 5-6 years. And the immigration in the sense, interestingly, of the arrival of the black people, just to make it very explicitly, from Africa and some Muslim or so from the Syria disaster. The numbers are actually small. We're talking a grand total of at most 500,000 during the last 5-6 years. in a total of 5.9 million immigrants that are sitting currently in Italy, of which 1.2 are Romanian. And that, may have created the usual irritation that we all have, but wasn't a big deal. And once the ethnically different people started to arrive and religiously different people, that became a bomb. So that's going to be the issue. That's the short run. The long run reason for this is that the country has been insurrecting in a more or less irrational way, but insurrecting against bad government or malgoverno, as we say, since 92. If I have to read the long durée of this, this is nothing but another wave of a problem that is there. The Italian political and elite class haven't governed the country properly. Now, nobody governs their country ideally or properly. I mean, we have a lot of complaints here, France, anywhere. Italy happens to be, in my view, in the Western world, a couple of steps up or down, you choose, but away from the mean of misgovernment that may characterize US and UK or France and Germany, you name it. And this continuous populistic stance of they're all thieves, we're all good, if things are going wrong, it's because they're thieves, has been there since Mani Pulite, clean hands, I guess it was translated in English, 92, 94, that brought to the fall of the previous parties and brought to the growth of Berlusconi. Berlusconi made a lot of promises, they failed, the mechanism of corruption, bad government has kept going, and in particular after the 2008 crisis, and then the Greek crisis in particular, the thing has become dramatic, and so now we get. So that's the long run. And so if one wants to ask, where is the solution? Where is there? It's complicated because it's a long run problem. It's been sitting there for 30, 35 years. So that's my answer to that. In the short run, the immigration is the thing. The economic performance, here there is, I was tempted to say to our host, it looks like the propaganda is making it to the American Enterprise Institute, in the sense that there is no connection between Italian economic performances and the euro. Italian export is going as strong as it gets and more.
I will let Des defend the.
I'm joking. I'm joking. No, it's actually.
I'm not.
It's absolutely the appropriate question, in the sense that that's what's in the debate, and that's something that went through Italy. So you go to Italy now, and I think there is only one stance on which I wrote a couple of articles saying you guys don't understand. This is the opinion of 80% of the country. The only thing that makes this 5-star and the Lega particular is that they make it explicit, but the electoral base of half of the PD and the extreme left that went under Liberi Uguali, and then there was this fascinating party called Power to the People. I love that. Well, they got 1.8 or whatever.
The leukemia party. Liberi Uguali.
Yeah, Liberi. There is a widespread view, which is as insane as it gets, which is it's all the Germans' fault and the euro fault. It just doesn't square with the data. You look at the data, the Italian economic slowdown and crisis starts around the first debt crisis of 92. There are a few oscillations, there's a bit of inertia, but by the time the euro goes in, the TFP indicator, labor productivity, everything is flattening out and starting to go down. And if it is for that, even Germany gets into the euro very, very flat. In fact, very poorly. It's doing worse than Italy for a while. Then, the Germans reform and do what they got to do and took off. The Italian didn't, and it continued. But the relation with the euro just doesn't exist. If people are interested, we can try to get into it, but there is no evidence that it's an exchange rate problem. Now, just to give you an idea, the Italian popular view of the thing that it's all the exchange rate problem is so deeply rooted that roughly the exchange rate between the lira and the euro was 1,970 something when they fixed it. Mr. Berlusconi has got lots of applause during the electoral campaign by saying that the thing would have been solved if they had fixed it at 1,000. Then it would have been much better for it. Anybody that understands exchange rate, international trade, know how stupid this is, because it's exactly the opposite. But everybody applauded, the press included. Yeah, that gives you a measure of how ideological it is, and how completely it has nothing to do with facts. So the economic performance are not the reason. They're bad, but the euro is not the. What are the reasons? The reasons are, I think, what I say. And the implication, again, I'm with Alberto. My My view is very cynical and sociological. The Lega is the dangerous thing. It's got very strange relation. We may want to go back to it later with Putin. And it's the object to watch. The 5-star is essentially an employment office for aspiring politicians that haven't got a job. And they're not going to be willing to leave their nice salary at Congress. So their problem is to find a way of governing, stay in power. And the implications are going to be a little bit more of Democratic Christian Party. And with this, I think there was one last question. Oh, the Italian election, the EU core. That's really complicated. I think that what we're going to see, if I understand what's happening in Paris and Berlin, they're going to keep pushing verbally toward more integration. I don't think they're going to do it very much for the very simple reason that the key step next is to really integrate the banking system. This goes beyond Italy, and I may be wrong. I don't know those countries as well as I think I believe I know Italy, but I don't think there's much willingness on either side to release the public control or at least the privilege relations that each government has with their own banking system. And a true integration, the next step for a true economic integration is to really integrate the banking system. So I think there's going to be a lot of verbal statements on Merkel and Macron's side, which may be useful to lift the spirits, but Italy is not going to be really an issue because they're not going to do much, and there's not going to be a real proposal on the table.
Thank you, Michele. Let's turn to Eric Jones.
Sorry, I'm just going to steal that thing. All right, now, as you probably figured out from my accent, I'm the only one on this panel that actually lives in Italy. And, and so when I hear Alberto lay out 3 scenarios, and to be perfectly honest, I didn't really hear the big difference between numbers 2 and 3. And all the scenarios end up with disaster.
I think the 1 and 2 you meant.
No. 2 and 3. Two is look, number 1 is they do what they said. That's immediate disaster. Number 2 is they do what they think they can do. That's delayed disaster because they don't prepare themselves for the next recession. Number 3 is they do what everybody else did, which is what they think they could do, which is delayed disaster. So if I understood you correctly, we're basically looking at delayed disaster, and I've just got to get my kids out of high school before this really hits the fan. Now, there is I have some slides. Let's see, here they are. Look, I just want to make 4 points about Euroscepticism in Italy, because all of these stories that Alberto tells are stories where Italy ends up leaving the euro. And you would get the impression that Italy leaves the euro because Italians don't like European integration, which would actually be something new and interesting about Italians. Italians traditionally have liked European integration. But alas, Italians have become more skeptical. That doesn't mean that skepticism vis-a-vis Europe was what was decisive in this election. On the contrary, like most elections, this election was decided on domestic issues. But skepticism toward Europe and the euro does reveal a changing relationship between Italy and the rest of its European partners that I think is worth paying attention to. Because even if it wasn't decisive in the last elections, that doesn't mean it won't be decisive in the next elections, which is why I focus so much on scenarios 2 and 3 from Alberto, the idea of delayed agony, because I think delayed agony is a lot about Italians actually connecting the domestic issues they care about with the European issues that they really don't care about, and turning it into some toxic mix where they care about European issues in a very negative way. And so my advice to other Europeans is, whatever you do, don't encourage that tendency. Okay, now this is some data. My goal here really is just to get you to learn as much Italian as I know. And this is some data that basically shows you that these domestic issues were paramount over the European issues. And the one that you want to look for is on the, what is it? Now I have my watch on. All the way on the right-hand side of your screen, the one that says Cambiare l'Europa. If you look at it, what you see is that Europe lost importance and lost salience in the months that ran up to the election, right? They just didn't care about that. What they cared about were things like cutting taxes. They cared about things like putting Italians first, which is code for immigration. They cared about things related to corruption, and they cared about things related to inequality. And this is why I'm suspecting that the Five-Star Movement and the Lega are going to have to do something when they get into office, because Italians actually care about these issues. And in care about these issues, they're not going to let the Lega and the Five-Star Movement go beyond a 5-year electoral cycle without doing something that they promised that they would do. Having said that, Italy's relationship with the euro is changing, with Europe is changing. I've made a huge data annex that I can show you, but I'm not going to work you through. All I want to emphasize is that all of that data that we looked at shows this rising distrust and disaffection. And a lot of that toxicity comes from two very specific issues. One is the issue that Alberto already mentioned, which is immigration. The Italians feel as though they've been abandoned by the rest of Europe as the southernmost frontier, receiving all of those migrants again across the central Mediterranean route. And although the numbers in percentage terms are low, you have to understand when they received 180,000 migrants in 1 year, the processing capacity wasn't there. And as the northern borders were closed off by other countries, the stocks began to accumulate as well, and finding a way to get these migrants into shelters or into settlements has been a huge political problem that's generated lots of unrest. And one can only salute the current Minister of the Interior for his success at redistributing those migrants internally. If we hadn't stopped the flow of migrants in July of last year, this issue would have been all that we had talked about. But there's the other issue of banking as well. If you want to understand the fate of the PD right now, all you have to do is look at the resolution of 4 small banks in central Italy in December 2015 and the toxicity that that generated for the party as a whole, and then run that through the Monte dei Paschi di Siena story and up into the Veneto region, and you have a perfect excuse for why people hate the Democratic Party. They hate the Democratic Party because it threatens their savings in a very profound and recognizable way. I mean, just to put not too fine a point on it, Maria Elena Boschi, who was Matteo Renzi's closest ally, could not be run in her home city of Arezzo. They had to find a district as far away from Arezzo as possible to find her a safe seat, and she was supported by the nationalist community in that district because nobody else would vote for her. And that's the kind of toxicity that explains the rise of the five-star movement and the Lega at the same time. And what we're seeing also, as this is taking place, is a change in Italy's political geography. And this political geography is important, right? Because what's happening is you've got a center-right that represents the north, and you've got a five-star movement that's actually concentrated in the south, and squeezed between them is the center-left, which is why I'm a little bit dubious about the idea that the five-star movement is ever going to form any relationship with the PD, and very understanding of why the PD doesn't want to get into bed with the five-star movement, right? Because in that squeeze, they're most susceptible, as PD, to lose voters and support to the five-star movement. And if you look at the flow of votes out of the PD from the peak of its performance in 2014 to this disaster in 2018, what you'll find is that 1 in 5 PD supporters actually shifted over to the five-star movement. Another 1 in 5 shifted out of the electorate altogether. And these kinds of transfers are not something that any center-left party can suffer easily. And in fact, every center-left party is going through a similar thing across Europe. So the PD is not unique in that respect. Another thing to pay attention to is that in the Senate, the combination of five-star and PD gives them a majority of 1 seat. And that majority simply would not hold unless they can get some people from the mixed group to come and support them. And the likelihood that they would be able to keep all of the PD together in that alliance is, I would suggest, very, very low. So as much as Di Maio may be talking about forming an alliance with the PD, I think it's more posturing than anything else, because the likelihood of doing so in an effective manner and generating a governing coalition is actually quite reduced. So what does that mean? Well, what it means is that we have to look at how the M5, the five-star movement, and the Lega come together. And they actually have relatively different constituencies. Your prototypical five-star voter is an educated young person who went to university, lives in an urban environment, and for whatever reason didn't find a job, which means basically it's just about anybody under the age of 35 in Italy. Your average Lega voter is a little bit older, more likely to be working class, and has an industrial background, much more concerned about their pensions. So the question is how we bring these different groups together in a way that creates a coherent economic program that doesn't break the Italian fiscal budget. And I think it's going to be hard for them to reconcile. If they want to do anything, as Di Maio is suggesting, let's have a contract for the government. If they want to do anything, they're going to have to do it in a balanced way, and they're going to have to balance also the fiscal requirements being demanded by the European Union. And I suspect that's not going to be easy for them to achieve. And Europe shouldn't push them too hard in this respect. Now here, Michele talked a little bit about the big macroeconomic governance issue. Italy actually has legitimate concerns in the macroeconomic governance debate. It has legitimate concerns about the importance of having the same deposit insurance across all of Europe, because, just to give you an illustration, when the Deutsche Bank changed from being a subsidiary to being a branch in Belgium and then fell under German deposit insurance as opposed to Belgian deposit insurance as a consequence, they took out a full-page ad in the Flemish newspaper announcing that this is the best time to move your money out of Belgian banks and into German banks, because then they'll be as safe as if they were in Germany. In Italy, at the same time in 2011, Deutsche Bank hired new staff to help people get their money out of Italian banks so that they could go to Deutsche Bank, which would bolster their balance sheets, but obviously at the detriment of those banks in Italy itself. And so there's a legitimate concern there, particularly as the Northern Europeans are trying to get them to provide against their NPLs, their non-performing loans, at a very high rate and a very accelerated calendar relative to the accounting standards that we have today, and to the extent to which Northern Europeans are trying to put limits on the amount that banks can hold of their own country's sovereign debt, which means basically that the Italian banks would have a fire sale of Italian government bonds in order to meet the standard. Now, this is not something that we think is going to happen, but if it were to happen, it would be a problem. Now, in that context, I think what we need to do is to allow the Italians to adjust to the new environment. Whether this government is capable of doing that, I really don't know. We're going to have to wait and see. I think the scenarios that Alberto and Michele laid out are realistic. What's not realistic to me is that I'm going to have to live through some kind of disaster, because that's just not something I want to admit. Thanks.
Thank you.
There's a lot to click through, unfortunately.
Okay.
There you go.
Thanks. I guess I agree with a bit of what the other speakers have said, but I take a less optimistic view of the Italian outlook, and I might suggest to Eric that he begins packing.
You don't like the idea of delayed
The
disaster?
disaster is coming a little bit earlier than he thinks.
He wants it right away. Let's get over with and start fresh.
The two reasons, basic reasons that I'm concerned is it's not necessarily what this government will do, that the other speakers have indicated that they might do stuff, in terms of pensions or in terms of the budget that might be very destabilizing. I'm concerned that even if they don't do that, what they're not going to do is they're not going to get the Italian economy to grow. And if they don't get the Italian economy to grow, the Italian economy is hugely vulnerable to a change in circumstances. So I've got deep pessimism about Italy in that sense. If it didn't grow before, I don't see why Italy is going to grow now, with 50% of the seats in parliament likely to be held by populist parties for the next 5 years. It doesn't look very good on the growth front. The point with Europe, I agree with Alberto when he says that, from Europe's point of view, Italy is too big to fail. But I would add to that Italy is also too big for Europe to save, that the amounts of money that we're talking about, either in terms of the debt that Italy has or the amount of bank deposits that can actually flee, there's going to be limits to what even Germany would be prepared to do, even if it was wanting to do it, that it just costs too much. So let me just structure my comments in the following way. First, I'll just talk a little bit about the vulnerabilities of Italy. Second, I'll talk about why the euro was a singularly bad idea, both for Italy and for Europe. The third, I'll just talk a little about how external circumstances that have been keeping Italy afloat are very likely to change relatively soon. And then maybe a word just about the threat to the euro from Italy. So just starting with the vulnerabilities, the most obvious vulnerability is Italy doesn't grow. This particular chart, just shows Italy's GDP per capita. You're looking since 2005. Italy is below where it was in 2005. Italy's had a triple-dip recession. If you look from the 2008 crisis, Italy hasn't regained its level of GDP in 2008. I mean, this is rather remarkable. It's something like 5% down from where it was in 2008. Unemployment, of course, is a problem. Unemployment from a regional point of view, very high in the south, but even on average, Italy's employment level is something to be desired. But the main point I wanted to stress is that Italy hasn't grown for something like 20 years. It's pretty miserable in terms of growth performance. The second vulnerability is obviously the debt level. You know, this chart goes back 100 years, shows that, you know, certainly since the post-war period, Italy's debt level just seems to rise. So since the crisis in 2010, they haven't really taken advantage of the lull, shall I say, 2012, when Draghi really entered into the market in a big way with doing whatever it takes. Italy's debt just keeps going up. So we've got Italy's debt now. Public debt is something like 133% of GDP. That is the second highest in the euro area. You know, only Greece manages to be higher than Italy. So that's a big vulnerability. The third vulnerability is Italy's banking system. You know, this is really a rather rickety banking system. Non-performing loans are still something like 15% of the balance sheet. So if Italy doesn't grow, it's difficult to see how it solves its banking problem. So it's just a matter of time before the next recession comes and these vulnerabilities are exposed. Why do I think the euro was a big mistake for Italy and Europe? It just made absolutely no sense to link in a monetary union two countries that are so different in terms of productivity performance. So what we've got is we've got a Germany that is somewhat of a productivity powerhouse. It increases productivity over time. Italy doesn't. I am pessimistic that the fact that Italy hasn't done well on productivity performance with more reasonable kind of governments, with a populist government, I don't hold out any hope that that changes. So what we see is just in turn, this chart is just showing you the difference in productivity. If you look from 2000, Italy's total factor productivity has declined, Germany's has increased, and the net result is that in this chart, in terms of just looking at labor costs, Italy's managed to lose something like 20% of competitiveness to Germany. So it makes absolutely perfect sense to me that if one country is continuing to lose in competitiveness, that country is going to stagnate, the other country is going to grow. That, to me, does not look like that is a sustainable proposition. Let me just say a word about the external environment, that Italy has been growing a little bit faster the last 2 years, that Italy's growth picked up, but it still lagged considerably behind that of the rest of Europe, you know, the Germanys and so on. Now, a pity Italy shouldn't be growing when interest rates are at the lowest that they've been historically. The euro was weak and oil prices were low. You know, with such an external environment, it's difficult not to grow. That external environment, in my view, is going to be changing pretty soon. The Federal Reserve is already tightening liquidity. Interest rates are already going up. The ECB is intimating that it's going to be stopping its purchase of bonds. So you're going to have a changed external environment that can really expose Italy. And also, I should just add that the global economy has been experiencing synchronized economic recovery. So in a less favorable global environment, the vulnerabilities I've mentioned could be exposed. What is particularly important, this chart just shows interest rates really at historic lows across Europe, but what's also occurred is, which doesn't make much sense to me, is that the spread between Italian bonds and German bonds is pretty low. It's only something like 1.5 percentage points, Italy manages to borrow, with all of its problems, it manages to borrow at a lower rate than does the United States Treasury, which is not something that is going to last long. And the reason that it can do that is that the European Central Bank is buying $60 billion of bonds a month. That really keeps those bonds well bid. What you can see from this chart is that the European Central Bank is now owning a huge quantity of Italian bonds. If that program stops, as it's very likely to do either in September or towards the end of the year, Italy is going to have a problem financing its government. The last point that I'd make is Italy, too big to save, too big to fail. Italy, being the third largest country in the Eurozone, obviously it's difficult to imagine the euro without Italy. So in that sense, you'd think that every effort is going to be made to keep it afloat. But Italy is also the world's third largest bond market. It's got a very large banking system. As capital flows out, the Germans are going to have problems. This is just a chart of the Target 2 balances. Target 2 balances already, Germany's got a $900 billion creditor position in the Target 2 accounts. Italy's got a creditor debtor position of something like $450 billion. If capital starts flowing out of Italy and the German creditor position goes beyond $1 trillion, I'm not too sure that the Germans are going to be too excited about keeping Italy afloat. So in short, I think Italy is an accident waiting to happen, and I think it could occur sooner than we think. All it's going to take is a change in risk appetite of global markets for that to occur.
Well, thank you, Desmond. That was indeed even more pessimistic than Alberto's story. So I want to give everyone the opportunity to respond to what we've heard before we move on to a few of my questions. So Alberto, so you had a third scenario that did not, according to you, that would not lead to disaster, right? That's one where there's muddling through. Desmond seems skeptical about that possibility. Would you want to talk about that a little bit? And then I know you want to talk about immigration.
I'm going to say a couple of unrelated things. So if you want, I can start from that one. In fact, I want to disagree about a couple of things with Eric. The first one is that the three scenarios are actually quite different. The first scenario is an immediate disaster. The second scenario is, well, delayed disaster, but perhaps less of a disaster. The third one is very different. The third one is keep doing what Italy has been doing for the last 20 years, but without a disaster. I mean, stagnation, reasonably low growth, but being part of the European Union and continue to do what is doing, more or less. You're saying, well, but if the Five-Star Movement and the Lega don't do what they promised, they may be thrown out of office in the next election. Maybe that has happened before. I wouldn't be surprised. That's exactly what may happen. And the other point is that the reason why we may see more of the same is that some of the names that circulate about economic minister and other minister for the Five-Star Movement are actually, sort of reasonable names. So it's another indication of the way they are moving. I also don't agree with you about UK. I think you give too much importance to the banks about the collapse of the PD. I mean, the banks that collapse and the connection with the PD the connection with the PD are big, but the banks are small. Okay, Boschi may have some trouble, but Boschi is not the whole CD. I think the CD collapsed, amongst other things, because of immigration, which we're going to talk about in a second, and because of their incredible division, and they are the most self-deprecate. It's a disaster in terms of in being unable to be united. I mean, they're still showing around people like D'Alema and company, and who would vote who would vote for them. So I think the bank, relative to all of these, is a more potato. So let me say a couple of things about immigration, because I happen to be doing some academic work on it, and we have been running a surveys with my colleague Stefano Stanceva in 6 countries: UK, US, France, Italy, Germany, and Sweden. These are serious surveys, done by a real survey company. It costs a lot of money. There are thousands of respondents. So as far as surveys are concerned, these are sort of reasonable number. I won't go into the detail, but they're reasonable surveys. In all of these countries, people vastly overestimate how many immigrants there are. And by immigrants, we define people, and we made it clear to the respondent, we define people born abroad but living legally in the country. In Italy, there are about 11% of immigrants defined as such. And in our survey, the average respondent believed that there are almost 30% of immigrants, so 3 times as much. And they think that the percentage of Muslim or Middle Eastern living in Italy, or North African, and sort of the more problematic type of immigrant, from the point of view of our culture, they think that they are more than 15%, even though they are actually less than 4%. So there is a huge and incidentally, they also think that the immigrants are much poorer and less educated than they actually are, even though, in fact, in Italy, the immigrants are the poorest and the less educated than most OECD countries, certainly more than our country, in our sample. So part of the immigration problem is that indeed we have immigrants that are less educated and poorer than other countries, but also there's a huge problem of misperception. Italy feels invaded much more than it actually is, and of course, somebody like Salvini uses these sentiments, and I think that's one of the reasons why the PD lost. Finally, whether or not the euro was a good idea or not, I think is too much of a long discussion to have here, but I do agree. I do agree that the quantitative easing of Draghi has probably lasted too long, and now I think now probably the Germans are a little bit right in saying that the quantitative easing of Draghi is making countries like Italy to, they allow them to not to do what they should be doing. So I agree that the quantitative easing should stop, will stop, and that will add another burden on the Italian debt.
Thanks, Alberto. Michele, do you want to talk a little bit about immigration policy too? And I want to see if you can. So Eric and Desmond were both sounded more convinced than you say that Italy is stuck in sort of a trap within the European Union. I wanted to hear your response to that. Also, in light of the fact that certainly Desmond emphasized that Italy has also benefited from very low interest rates that it wouldn't necessarily have faced if it were outside of the Eurozone.
Right. Yeah. No, I'm not going to say much about the immigrants. God knows. We used to disagree, Alberto. What is going on? Are you becoming more like me, or I'm becoming more like you? We're converging.
You're converging.
I think the thing Alberto said, I share. I would say even more. Let me add 2 things, a bit stronger. The immigrants became a problem because the leading elite became a problem, and there is the misperception is underlying. Seems to be a very strange game. I've been monitoring this very clearly. One of the ways in which the anti-immigration, let me be explicit, the anti-African guy or anti-Muslim guy obsession in Italy has picked up real strongly is purely sexual. It's the big black man coming here to rape our women. Let's just mimic it. If we want to understand what's going on, we better understand the way. And one thing I've noticed in the last year and a half is that there's been a number of episodes in Italy of violence on women. And I would say that they were percentually equally distributed, not 1 to 9, but say 2 to 8, between the bad black guy and the other 8 being Italians. And the way in which they were, this would be worth some good sociology student thesis, they were treated, handled, and distributed through the media is amazingly different, amazing. Interestingly, all the media. I'm not talking conspiracy here, it's an interesting cultural reaction. That is, Corriere della Sera, which is considered fairly moderate, always center establishment newspaper, has been salivating over these things in a fairly disturbing way, as much as the most extreme super right wing, say Libero or Giornale, that always make title, kill them and then cut their blah blah blah, right? So there is a construction of the misperceptions very strong, which brings me to the other thing also. Eric, I tell you, the banking system in Italy has not been destroyed by the PD. The banking system in Italy has been destroyed by itself to start with, and by many other people with the PD, Berlusconi for first. But again, in terms of misperception, yes, there were the 4 small central banks that he mentioned, and they were a big roar on the media. In terms of failure, there were 2 Veneto Bank, from where I'm from, much bigger economically, much more disastrous, and that's a Lega disaster. The leading group of both those banks was strictly connected to Zaia, the leading thing. This never made it through the press. And in fact, the public purse spent much more money about, the Eurostat just reminded the Italian government, you guys got to fix your deficit. It's a bit bigger because you got 5 billion, maybe 7 that you've spent to keep those banks afloat. But interestingly, that thing, there was if you wanted to attribute it politically to a specific party, I don't think it's actually correct, because it's the old system that is extremely bad design and prone for that and blah, blah, blah. You had to attribute it to the Lega much more than the 4 central Italian banks could be attributed to PD. This just did not happen. But the funny thing is that did not even happen on the leftist newspapers. I didn't see Repubblica say, what's Lega, what's Zaia saying about Veneto Banca? They're all his buddies from his town. He created it. He literally did. So, it's a bit of a strange thing. The same goes for this. Let me also disagree. You're portraying there are various proposals to try to disentangle the public debt from the banking system. One thing that has been disastrous and caused part of the 2011 crisis was that the lack of trust in some of the national public debt. This was true for Spain and Italy in particular, became also dramatic decapitalization. The national bank, they became unable to lend. This is because they're heavily exposed to national debt. So this has been a discussion, technical, but completely obvious, that you want to at least separate the two so that a shock to the public debt does not transform itself into also a shock to the nation banking system. Obviously, this required diversifying your debt. There are various proposals around. Some colleagues have tried one particular complicated one. It has a chance, but I think it's too sophisticated to work because it imitates mortgage-backed securities. But anyhow, that's not the matter. There is a debate around, and it's a serious problem. I don't think it's fair to portray that as the Northern wants the Italian bank to do a fire sale of the public debt. The Northern are trying to avoid that the Italian banks go down again, next time the Italian public debt goes down again. And finally, again on the euro, we really should, the euro might have been, I used to be against the euro in a sense, but this would get us into too long a discussion. But we better, it was here on the data that Desmond was showing. Look at that TFP. It goes flat way before the euro. In fact, it goes flat in the 90s. Then there is that jump, which is actually, for people that know how productivity is measured, it's a mismeasurement problem, that post-95, 97. And then it goes flat completely and then finally going down. So the problem starts way back for Italy. The euro, as we have been all talking about a disaster waiting to happen, we might say, given that we are in 2018, that it could have been better. But without the euro, Italy would have failed in 1996. It's as simple as that. I mean, it was only the perspective and the strange operation that Ciampi and the other did between 92, 94 first, and then again 95, 96 that assured the entry into the euro, that stopped the fear of the Italian debt, it brought the spread on. I've been doing back of the envelope calculation for years. The spread between the Bund and the Italian bond, okay, has disappeared for something like 15, almost 20 years at this point. If you take even a reasonable spread, pretending that the market would have, not treated Italy worse than they were treating it in 95, 96, which I think it's a very, very, very brave assumption. But even that would have charged on Italian taxpayer gigantic number between 500 and 700 billion euros. So that's the big gift of the euro. The euro allowed the Italian to survive and gave them 20-year option to fix their finances, to fix their internal system, to fix their tax system and their school system and their market system. It was a gigantic lift that costed the rest of the countries in Europe quite a bit because it was a transfer of risk and a burden, right? Italy was in some sense the major beneficiary. So I think if we want to keep talking about the euro, we can, but we better put this thing into perspective. For the future then, and I close, I really think that Alberto is right on the fact that the third perspective is the right one. They're going to go the muddling. The problem of Italy, if you want to keep understanding Italy for the years to come, unless there is a dramatic change in the culture and the politics of the country, it's a country that has decided to slowly decline while staying afloat because it's tied to other ships, the French, the German, the Dutch, that keep pushing. In fact, Italy's GNP is growing because the export is growing, and the export is growing because the rest of Europe is growing. In fact, it's not a problem of productivity when you measure it properly. When you measure productivity and competitiveness in the part of the manufacturing and industrial sector, their export, that small world is still there and is staying afloat. The problem is in the rest, but I don't think there is. The rest just wants to survive. I'm not expecting any disaster, frankly, and I don't think the political thing will create a disaster out of it.
Thank you, Eric. I don't think Alberto and Michele agree with you on the banks.
I don't know what they're thinking. First, Michele, I don't want to come across as a gloom and doom guy. Let's face reality. The spread right now is not 150 basis points. It's 127. It's 127 down from 139 on the day the election took place or the day after the election took place. So in other words, the markets are looking at this and shrugging and saying, whatever, we're going to buy Italian bonds anyway. And I think that that's probably right, at least for the short to medium term. We're not going to see disaster strike. So I'm fairly confident in that. And we're not going to see disaster strike because of the end of quantitative easing in Europe either. Now, we have to be very careful about this. The net asset purchases of 30 billion euros a month are probably going to wind up in September. But the ECB is going to continue to reinvest maturing principal on its balance sheet for the foreseeable future. In other words, all those bonds that Desmond showed that the ECB has accumulated are going to stay on the balance sheet of the ECB, and they're going to reinvest on a like-for-like basis. So it's not as though suddenly you're going to get a whole bunch of absent demand for Italian bonds in the market, another reason why the spread is so low. And the other thing that keeps the spread low is that the Euro system actually provides these very powerful insurance mechanisms. And the most important of these is Target 2. Now, Target 2 provides instant and theoretically infinite, as long as you've got the collateral, balance of payments financing assistance, right? You have a balance of payments crisis, the liquidity just shows up. And that's why you see Italy's position going into the debit, right? Imagine if Italy had actually to finance its balance of payments. Then in 2011, when Italy started out in June of 2011 with a surplus position on its Target 2 accounts of about 8 billion euros and ended the year with a debit position of about 200 billion euros, where in the course of those 6 months Italy was going to get 200 billion euros in balance of payments financing is anybody's guess, right? But the fact of the matter is the Euro system provided that automatically. And that is something we're celebrating. It held the country together in the face of an unprecedented balance of payments crisis. What was the balance of payments crisis? Well, the crisis came because foreigners who held Italian sovereign debt liquidated about 20% of the country's GDP worth of Italian sovereign debt and pulled that money right out of the country, right? So they had about 50% of Italy's sovereign debt at the start of the period and about 35% of Italy's sovereign debt at the end of the period. Now, in that huge liquidation of Italian sovereign debt and repatriation of capital, Italy experienced what's called a sudden stop. And the Italian economy saw its liquidity freeze up across the banking system. The PD didn't destroy the banking system. What happened to the banking system is it basically ran out of liquidity. But the state also faced a problem in making sure that its bonds would roll over and enter Mario Draghi as president of the ECB. What Mario Draghi did was introduce long-term refinancing operations, and the Bank of Italy allowed the banks to write bonds for themselves that would be underwritten by the Italian government. They pledged those bonds for liquidity. They got the liquidity under the long-term refinancing operations, and they used them to buy Italian sovereign debt. That's why the Italian banking system is loaded up with Italian sovereign debt today, because the Italian banking system was the buyer of last resort in the context of a fire sale that was perpetrated by foreigners, right? Now, when I talk to people at the Bank of Italy and when I talk to people at the ECB about Italy's unique position in this particular financial arrangement, what they say is, look, we've done a study, and the banks that are heavily exposed to Italian sovereign debt are no less profitable and no more vulnerable than banks that are not heavily exposed to their home country sovereign debt. In other words, the study that the ECB has done and the study that the Bank of Italy has done denies that the doom loop works in the way Michele suggests it does, and instead provides the banks as an outlet for the sale of government bonds to ensure that they roll over smoothly in the process of routine refinancing. And so what the people both at the Bank of Italy and at the ECB tell me is, why would we want to give this up as a possibility by putting an artificial limit on the amount of bonds that Italian banks can hold? Nevertheless, there is the argument that Michele faithfully repeated, which is that this makes banks vulnerable, and my friends in the government in the Netherlands or in the government in Sweden tell me that they want to see this level of bond exposure go down so that their banks will be more safe. And when I try to say, well, it doesn't really work that way, they tell me the same thing that you heard right now, which is that I'm wrong and obviously don't know what I'm talking about. And that's okay, because there is a... But there is that consideration. The other thing is about the role of the banks in politics, right? See, the problem with banks in Italy is that their funding and their assets are all local, which means that if you have to bail in their creditors, you bail in the local community. We did a bunch of surveys with SWG, 3,000 long or wide samples, looking at public opinion toward banks, migration, the referendum campaign, and the individual political parties. Now, in the context of the run-up to the referendum, we had this problem that so many people were undecided. So we built a model that looked at the mood music in terms of attitudes toward banks, political parties, and migration. And as early as August of 2016, we were able to divide out the undecided into how they were likely to vote and predicted within 2 percentage points the actual outcome. This mood music is important, not in a causal sense. I'm not saying that attitudes toward banks cause things, but because people who tend to hold attitudes toward banks that are bad or migration that's bad tend to be skeptical of politics and tend to be skeptical of change. And this is the problem that Italy faces. I agree with both Michele and Alberto. We're likely to see a muddling through scenario, very little change. But that doesn't mean that Italians are willing to accept that scenario well into the future. And I think that's the problem that we face. We need to have a political response to this. If it's not coming from the Five-Star Movement and it's not coming from the Lega, then where's it going to come from? Because I think that's the question that we don't really want to answer, because I don't think it's going to come from the PD, Forza Italia, or any of the traditional mainstream parties.
It was supposed to come from the party I created, but it didn't work out.
Desmond, you want to talk about?
Yeah, well,
So do you agree that the euro has been the greatest thing that's ever happened to Italy?
Awesome. Let me rather start with the muddling through scenario, which all three of my fellow panelists seem to think is going to occur. I just don't buy that. That I would see the situation quite differently. Italy faced the abyss in 2011, 2012. Spreads blew out 7%. The debt was looking unsustainable. What pulled Italy back from the abyss were two things. One was Mario Draghi deciding that he was going to do whatever it took that he would create this OMT, this outright monetary transaction. He'd spend as much of the ECB's money to make sure that the bonds would stay well bid. So that really succeeded in calming the markets down. The second thing that kept Italy afloat over the past number of years is the global liquidity situation. The fact that central banks were printing money as if it was going out of fashion, markets ready were buying any kind of assets. That really explains the spread compression that you see across markets, emerging markets, high-yield markets, including Italy. What I'm suggesting is that if Italy just thinks it's going to muddle through, they're very mistaken, because the situations that have kept it afloat are now going to change, that the ECB is going to stop buying the bonds. The changes in Germany are going to make it very difficult for the ECB to do whatever it takes another time around. And United States interest rates are going up, or we're having a trade war that's going to be making markets jittery. I don't see that as being too positive for Italy. So I think that if they've got the vulnerabilities, it's just a matter of time before risk appetite changes. Markets make another evaluation. I wouldn't take too much comfort from the fact that the spreads are remaining low immediately after the election. That can change on a dime, and when it does, the dynamics are pretty bad. A point that I'd make is, in terms of the euro and growth, it just strikes me, looking at a long-term chart, there's a very clear break. Italy grows until something like 1999. Then, for the last 20 years, Italy literally hasn't grown. I think that they might be a couple of percentage points higher than they were in 1990. 2 lost decades, and membership of the euro, maybe the two are related. Maybe it's got to do with something like that you've got to try to do fiscal adjustment in a monetary straitjacket. That's not a good idea. When you do fiscal tightening, Italy has a triple-dip recession after 2008. Its performance has been totally disastrous. I don't see how you can make the argument that the euro has been good for Italy. They don't have this ability to devalue their currency to regain competitiveness the quick way. What they've got to do is just grind that economy down. I'd make the point on the situation of the banks. I don't know whether it's one political party or another political party. I would just say that any country that has a triple-dip recession and has prolonged period of economic stagnation is going to have very high non-performing loans in its banking system. The fact that the economy has performed so disastrously leads to weakness in the banks, and that's a problem going forward. The last thing I would say is that this doom loop is just another reason to worry about the banks. I've mentioned that the banks have got 15% of their balance sheet is non-performing loans. If you overlay that with the fact that another something like 10% of their balance sheet is they're holding Italian bonds of dubious value and marking it as if this is a AAA asset, that's a joke. The banks are already in very bad shape, and it would seem to me it's just a matter of time before money starts leaving Italy again.
Italy, you want,
just a clarification. I think I've been dragged into the stagnation prediction too, more than I wanted to, by these two people, because I actually pointed out 3 scenarios, and the disaster now was the least likely, but I started saying that the other 2 delayed disaster or stagnation were equally likely. So I wouldn't say that I said that I predict stagnation. I said that there is uncertainty. It could be either stagnation or a delayed disaster when quantitative easing ends, if there is a trade war and some other negative shock occurs.
Excellent. I'm going to use my power here as moderator to ask a couple of questions, and then I think we can turn to the audience. So the first question I want to ask all of you, to the extent that you have strongly held views on this. I would like to get a better sense of where you think the Five Star Movement and the Lega Norte, where they stand, what their leadership is like, what their policy goals are, those kind of things. Because we've talked about them in general terms, but I would like to see if we can get a sort of more specific sense of what their role is going to be. Now that they're Italy's two dominant political parties, and whoever wants to go first can go first. Michele?
Let's see, to answer you. They're very different. And I think, Eric said a few things, and I tend to agree. I mean, again, the mode of a distribution is not the old distribution, but it's true. The Five Star Movement is the party of the protest, a bit of everything. It's a strange mixture ideologically of post-leftist Guevara's view of the world. It goes from happy decline to super environmental greenish thing to let's all cultivate our own vegetables and get our little pork in the terrace stuff. I fish only my sea, kilometro zero, and so on and so forth.
In the Netherlands, we have a party for the animals that, among other things, argues for the freedom of farm animals to choose their own sexual partner.
Well, I'm sure there's somebody in the. It's an interesting thing. You understand? It's an object created by a very wise, if secretive and somewhat devilish, marketing company that monitors and controls the whole thing. It's a strange exercise in Big Brother. There's no time, but I invite you to read about that. It's a very interesting thing. So it has this component, but then it has another component, which I call fascist, and people get very upset because we tend to associate fascism to the pure repression, the authoritarian, the violence, and so on. No. I mean fascist in the Italian sense. They invented it after all, right? And it is a very particular party. It's actually an offspring of the Risorgimento and the Italian culture at the end of the 19th century, which is the celebration of this great mistreated country, which is the cradle of any culture and civilization we have, because we are poets and all that crap, and proletarian and poor, but humbly poor and nicely poor, because we can cite Latin and Greek verses and so on. And you may have your New York, but I've got my seaside. Have you seen my seaside in the South? Well, it's not worth your New York, your Silicon Valley. I'm more important. It's a very deeply rooted thing in Italy. And the Cinque Stelle is a perfect synthesis between these two. And it creates a strange form of national pride, which is hard to handle, and it's also easily manipulable, because it builds this idea that there is these pure people that are the Italians, and that have studied, and they all are philosophers and artists. The typical thing there is, I want to be a poet, but I'm supposed to be cleaning floors. Hence, I deserve the minimum wage from the state so that I can write poems. And I had recently debate with that, and I was obviously treated like the ugly marketeers, liberal bastards. He says, you got to earn your living. If people don't like your poems, you'll have to be a poet on the free time, and you'll have to be a bartender to earn a living. It's a matter of exchange and fairness among people. I'm not kidding, this is a very deep, so the Cinque Stelle is a very particular beast. Lega is simpler. Lega is your small, medium enterprise, artisans, shopkeepers, small firms, also manufacturing small firms, small and medium firms work at north and center, with an extension in the south that is purely racist. The great thing, so they took that, which was the old Federalist Lega, that remained, kind of came back. It's actually, those people have a mixed feeling about the immigrants. Why? Well, they got them in the factory. My friends that vote Lega in Treviso, that I know very well, are double feelings about it, because 40% of their workforce, 60% of their workforce for some, is actually immigrants. And they work hard, and they know they would go under without them. But on the other hand, they resent seeing them in the middle of the square, and especially if they're black.
They should commute from work.
Yes, they would like the southern solution, which is southern agriculture, which is very inefficient and very poor. and I close here, I hope I have answered a bit, but lives, in fact, on immigrants and illegally. That honestly, and I've been visiting the South quite frequently in the last few years for a variety of reasons, living well, take away the semi, live in near slavery situation. There are literally isolated lager villages in which they live. You look at the culture of the Pachino and all, the Tavoliere di Puglia, it lives on absolutely super cheap black labor, imported semi-legally, that works on salaries of €2, €3 an hour, even less, and then is shunned away. So, yeah.
Eric?
Yeah, I want to add something to this because I think it's important. There are also these are two parties, the Lega on the one hand, Five Star Movement on the other hand, that are very different in terms of style, right? The Lega is old school, retail, populist. They do things locally. They're very present in the local community. If you go up north and it's campaign season, you see them everywhere. And in that sense, they actually are committed to a program. You know what the program is. They're going to do the program, right? The Five Star Movement is this new weird techno-populism. And techno-populism has two characteristics that I think are not well understood. One is the ephemeral nature of the flash mob, so the meetup, where they all get together and they have Vafanculo Day or whatever, and you look at it, but then they disperse, and there's no real permanence there. And the other thing is the way that internet democracy is managed and edited after the fact. I had a student who went and looked at the way that their website actually works and the discussions that get deleted when they go against whatever the current whim of the leadership is. And that makes them a much more whimsical, much less reliable party. They're not the same as the Lega in being dependable. And that's why you see also Di Maio flip-flopping on issues in what for a normal party would be a very dramatic way, but for him, he can do it. I think one of my colleagues, and I won't name them because I'm probably going to misquote them, described Di Maio as the front man put out by an ad agency. And in many respects, that's it. But we just don't know what the message is, right? And the message can change much more quickly. So I'm much more convinced that the Lega is going to stick to its principles than I am that Five Star Movement is. And as a final point, of the two parties, the Lega is the oldest political party in Italy right now, believe it or not. And the Five Star Movement is one of the youngest.
Yeah, right.
And the other thing I wanted to talk about a little bit more is, and there's been some fighting over it already, the banks that went under over the past couple of years in Italy. Weren't we supposed to have a European single resolution mechanism that would? No,
We took exception.
We had to, because otherwise we would have wiped out the Veneto region.
Can you talk about that a little more? How did that work out politically? How did they? Well,
it was mostly political.
Yeah.
The details are boringly technical, but it was
Okay.
political. And it's actually what Eric said. All the small banks, and Monte dei Paschi as well. But Monte dei Paschi was before, so they muddled through. It's been there since what? When did the thing started? 10?
Yeah.
I think it was 10 that
10,
started to
yeah.
pop out, right? So they've been muddling through for 8 years. And it was a political thing at the beginning. PD controlled it in that case, and they wanted to keep it there in the city. Now they've lost everything, but at this point, therefore. The other, yes, having adopted the bail-in would have impacted on the local communities, and it was a political issue, so the Italian government forced the...
Yeah, I think it was conditional on a bail-in clause, which for obvious reasons the Italians aren't too happy about.
Yeah.
But what they did is they just defined these two banks as non-systemically significant, and that allowed them to be resolved under national legislation.
Yes.
And then in the national legislation resolution, what they did is they just gave a fire sale to Anton Veneto. So Anton Veneto now, not Anton Veneto, but
Veneto Banca.
No,
and
Intesa
Popolare.
Sao Paulo. Intesa Sao
Intesa
Paulo
bought the two.
Yeah, bought the two.
So basically what they have done, they've taken the two
Yeah.
Veneto banks that were fairly large. The other were
I just wanted to
transferred them to
clarify why.
Intesa and covered that with public money.
How this ended up being like a clearly domestic issue as opposed to.
Look, we use,
Good.
and let me, this is relevant though. I mean, I know a bit Spain. I've been working and researching there for a while. Right at the same time, Spain solved the Popolare issue, completely according to rule. And it was no problem. And again, this problem, the political thing, to keep the banks within the country, they gave it to Santander. Santander grabbed it, but they paid. They paid what they had to pay for, they folded, they did the bail-in, there was no public money coming in. The Italian had to put the public money.
And maybe that'll happen in Italy next time as well.
Huh?
Maybe.
Yeah, maybe. I'm
Good.
sure Di Maio will take care of that.
Exactly. I want to open it up to questions from all of you. Let's start here at the left. Please wait for a mic. Say who you are and then ask your question.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Lorenzo Forni. I lead a think tank in Italy, actually in Bologna, where Eric lives. And I also teach a University of Padua in the north. So I think, sincerely, a lot of issues have been put on the table. Even I think too many. It's very difficult to navigate across all these issues. But there's a lot of gloom here. And if you look at Italy now compared to a few years ago, things are going much better on a number of dimensions. So, Italy went through, two big crises, and the 2008, 2009, and then again in the Euro debt crisis in 2011, 2012, there were, two deep recessions. The country would stand without, external support, which might not have been, the best strategy, but I'm not going to discuss about that. So what are the three main, I'll try to be short, sorry. I see already your face. What are the three main issues in Italy? The public debt, the banks, and the euro. Why markets are not concerned about the public debt? The debt dynamic is very stable now. I mean, interest rates are extremely low. The cost of the debt is low. The debt maturity is long. The primary surplus is 2%. If you shock that, you see that there is going to time to adjust, even if there is, some change in growth or change in interest rate. The external constraint. Exports are doing very good. They haven't done so good for years, and so that doesn't seem to be the biggest issue. The banks have been a trouble for 10 years. Now things have been more or less, to a certain extent adjusted. So my question is, why this election, changed completely, the landscape? I think just because, the Italians were not able to appreciate, these improvements after 10 years of such deep, recession, increasing unemployment, and so on and so forth. And, if election would have been 2 or 3 years down the road without any major international crisis, probably things would have been different. Now, the question is, usually Italy, is like that, and, there are ups and downs, and it's a very diverse and heterogeneous country. And the question is, usually what happens is that, from time to time a shock comes, and there is a reaction. This happened, with the Ciampi and Prodi, just to make the euro was not easy. This happened in 2011 with Monti. So, if another shock comes, what is going to be the reaction of the country? Is it going to stick to, the euro, the fiscal sustainability, or is it going to give up? So that's the question.
Well, what do you think, Des? Do you want to go first and talk about why you do not necessarily agree on that debt analysis?
Yeah, I think that what you're doing is, you're saying that the country is likely to be subjected to a shock at some point in time. Things have been relatively good the last couple of years, but what has to give one pause is that at the peak of the cycle, the vulnerabilities haven't declined, that the vulnerabilities are still clearly there, that the debt is 133% of GDP, the non-performing loans are 15% of GDP. That doesn't put the country in a good position to sustain an external shock. So the external shock can come from a variety of ways. We can have a global, that the global economy might not be as good as it is, that you might have change in the liquidity, that the interest rates go up. Italian interest rates don't stay at 2%. They go up, the spreads widen. The debt dynamics then don't look so good, and then you get yourself into a cycle, and then, you've got a problem as well, is that if Italy gets hit by an external shock, that brings you back to the problem with the euro, is that Italy gets hit by an external shock, GDP goes down, the budget widens, the Europeans say you've got to bring the deficit down to 3%. Okay, so you engage in fiscal tightening in a pro-cyclical way without the benefit of an exchange rate to value. So, my concern is that Italy hasn't reduced over the last, since 2012, Italian vulnerability hasn't declined, it's in fact increased. The debt has gone up, the non-performing loans have gone up, so it's not in a good position to sustain a shock.
Well, I mean, if somebody from Mars came into this room and listened, they would say, wait a second, are things going on great in Italy? They are terrible. We hear people saying exports are doing great, and people saying we are about to fall into great disaster. What's right? And to some extent, they're both right in the sense that when we talk about productivity in Italy, the average is bad, but there is the variance is very important. There are parts of the economy that are doing extremely well. In fact, they've done better when the Europe emerged, and part of the economy, part of this part related to the public sector that is gone very, very poorly. So depending on where you look, you can come up with a more rosier or a very negative story. Having said that, Lorenzo's description of Italy seemed a little bit too rosy in the sense that, yes, things are going better than before, but relative to Spain, Ireland, Portugal, we came out of the crisis less quickly and probably worse. We're still below the. And I think this is an issue. And related to a point that Michele was saying before, yes, the five-star movement has all the characteristics that it has, but he also gotten most of his support in the South, so it seemed like a way of the South of saying, we want more money, we want something from you, and it's something about the South. And a final point on the euro. We can debate on and on about the euro, and the interest rate and so forth. But if Italy got out of the euro, the interest rate on Italian debt would go to the roof because of the devaluation risk. So, as they were, by the way, before the euro. I mean, the interest rate on Italian debt in the early 90s were like 10% or something because there was the devaluation risk. So, again, for the euro itself, let's not. I think there are pros and cons. I think it's a tough question. And incidentally, we should not forget that one thing is to debate whether the euro was a good idea or not. Then the other thing is to say whether if it's a good idea for Italy or for any other country to get out now unilaterally.
No, I'd very much agree that once you're in, the cost of getting out, you don't really have, that's not going to be a pretty picture. So you've got to try to make the best of it. But an added reason I'd say that one has to have some kind of skepticism now is the kind of government that you're likely to get. That what Alberto has mentioned in one of his scenarios, that they decide to have a minimum income that's going to cost a boatload of money, or they change the pension reform, or they reverse some of the labor market reforms, you're just not going to get the growth. That growth is really key to Italy, and I would say that election has made those prospects look worse than they did before.
Thank you. Let's go right here. Sorry. Please hold for the mic. Yeah, sorry.
Hello, Una MacDonald. I want to ask a couple of questions. One is, can Italy ever succeed unless it tackles the deep-seated corruption, including still the influence of the mafiosa, for example, in its protection rackets on small businesses in Naples, for example? The other question is, some attempts to reform the influence of the foundations on the banking system. Can Italy's banking system ever improve unless the foundations running the banks, which makes them not only open to political influence, but the influence of local worthies, pet projects, bad lending, what can be done to remove the foundations from the Italian banking system so that banks can be run in a better way?
Look, no. I don't know. With Mario out, I mean, the only people that can try to push on that is literally the European Central Bank, with a variety of these regulation rule things are meant, in fact, to force and create straitjackets and incentive that makes the foundation less. One has to say, on a positive note, I don't know if you want to take it positively, foundations are being made less important now by brute force. They just lost all their capital. They were so purely managed. If the Italians really wanted to insurrect and hang somebody, they should have been hanging whoever ran the various foundations for the last 25 years.
Can you explain briefly what the role of the foundation is?
All right, very quickly. In the early 90s, Draghi started, at the time he was the general director of the Treasury, in cooperation with the central bank run by Ciampi. They said, look, we got all public bank, basically, and particularly a lot of saving and loan. Let's try to privatize them and going in steps. And the first big step was each bank, basically, creates a foundation and turns it itself into a limited liability company issuing share, takes the share, deposited it as a capital, as an endowment for the foundation, and now we have two separate things that kind of saves the face, because the local wealth remains in the community. The local foundation is supposed to help the widows and the orphans of the war and repair the street and fix Pompeii with that, and the bank can get into the market and shares can be traded. This process was supposed to go eventually farther, was blocked by Tremonti and the first Berlusconi government, because the Lega wanted to get their share of the banks. Basically, they said, look, wait a second, you've been managing banks for the last 30 years. We finally got some mayors, some provinces, some region. We can get our banks, and you're going to take them away, make them private, give it to the market. What is it? And that thing was stopped. Anyhow, I hope this explains for... So it's not in the cards, and certainly neither Lega nor Cinque Stelle has any desire to do that, for the reason I just said. They want their banks. They want to actually, Intesa is clearly under threat. They're going to try to jump and manage those things. The other, you're right, but you see, that's what I had in mind. Do we want to discuss, I think we are discussing the short term, if we want to understand why Italy is not Germany, is not France, is not even England, if you want, and it started to be not even Spain, and it's becoming this strange animal, we have to look at the long-run issues. And one of the long-run issues is that Italy is a very divided country. The federal option is crucial. It will never, I'm afraid, during my lifetime, become implementable. But as long as there is this centralized unified state that keeps together Sicily and Lombardy, the thing you said will never be eliminated, and some of the problems we're debating, the five-star vote that Alberto was mentioning, for example, will be there. Italy is a country that desperately needs some strong form of fiscal federalism, but the political equilibrium is such to make it impossible. So it's a catch-22, basically.
Can I just add one thing? Una, I think you're asking a really important question about these bank foundations. But you have to understand, when they did this thing in the early 1990s, the banks that they were privatizing actually were quasi-public institutions that served the local good. And so the foundations were created to provide public services. And the problem with this model, it was unimaginably successful, because the banks had all these foundations had all these bank shares. They became, almost overnight, the largest philanthropic units in Europe. And if you talk to people who study the third sector, they'll say, this is a model we would like to replicate. And yet, unfortunately, it does have this corrosive influence when they retain those shares. Some of the foundations divested from their original bank, and some of the foundations remained close to the original bank and played a role in administering the bank. And so there are ways that we could have done this better, right? But without these things, a lot of the public restoration, almost all of the museums, huge amounts of public institutions, the whole University of Siena. I mean, these things would not exist right now, because the foundations are the ones that were the major source of financing. So getting rid of them would be a real challenge politically, because of the good works that they do.
Thank you. Let's go to the next one.
No longer.
They're gone.
Yeah.
They're
Let's
destroying
go
themselves.
over here in the middle and then, light blue tie.
Thank you. Chris Cerrone with Zimmer Biomet. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on the implications for business of some of the political and economic trends that you laid out here in general, or what are the attractive economic sectors besides, let's say, tourism, and what would any Lega combination with five-star mean for business, and in particular healthcare, the healthcare sector in Italy? Thank you.
If I take just a very, I actually, this is a very interesting question because I was thinking, everybody talks about the Lega and five-star movement government as if it were sort of the obvious thing, but from the point of view of business, amongst other things, they couldn't be more farther away. I mean, the Lega wants low taxes and presumably, certainly low taxes. Five-star movement have promised a level of government spending that would require very high taxes. So on this point, they are actually on the opposite side of the political spectrum.
They can probably agree on high spending, low taxes, right?
Yeah, right. On healthcare, healthcare and pension is part of a much bigger issue about how to reform the Italian welfare state, which is very ineffective. And on this point, neither of the two has said anything intelligent so far. They want to eliminate the pension reform by Monti and Fornero, which would mean even more a welfare move towards pension rather than other support, and that would be a really step backward. I'm not an expert on health, but the issue of the health in Italy is that it's very cheap for everybody, including the very rich, and that makes it to some extent unfair in many ways, ineffective. But I think you're asking something much more detailed about the health sector that I'm not an expert on, so I'll leave it to the others.
Yeah, Eric, you want to?
Yeah, this point that Michele has been making repeatedly through this conversation, there are high productivity growth sectors in the Italian economy, particularly in the area where I am, in Emilia-Romagna and just a little bit to the north. One of those sectors is the health technology sector. So a lot of medical equipment is built there. And a lot of that industry was actually capital starved during the crisis. So there are actually some good bargains to be had in terms of going in and providing replacement capital. The same is true also in the light textile sector. So companies like La Perla, Furla, some of these are privately held, but they're also in need of capital. So La Perla, I think, was just recently bought out by a Chinese group. I think that there are real investment opportunities that could be taken care of. And these investment opportunities would continue to be attractive even if the five-star and the Lega got together. That said, and Ambrosetti and Cernobbia just the other day, they polled the business community and said, what do you guys want for a government? And not overwhelmingly, but the plurality of these people, about 30% of the business managers polled came back and said, what we really want is for centrodestra and PD to come together, right? What we really want is a return to the old center, and we're willing to tolerate the Lega in that company. And that, I would posit, is probably the least likely option.
Yeah.
I may be wrong.
Yeah.
Oh, no, I agree.
When Michele says things like Italy is a very divided country, he's not kidding. So there's parts of northern Italy that are among the most prosperous in all of Europe. It's not.
I think. Oh, sorry.
No.
Go.
Desmond, go.
I don't want to say
No.
anything.
What is it? And so, in terms of business, yes, the health sector actually, some of the private provision. Italy is not all public health. There's a growing private thing, which I've experienced myself. And I know that in the United States, people are very proud of their medical system. And let me tell you, you can do better. I'm actually very happy of the private being. I mean, I'm still an Italian citizen, but I can't use really the public system when I get there. So I go straight and use the private one. And I basically, short of an emergency, I take care of myself when I go to Italy. It costs about a third, and it's a lot more efficient. I don't have to wait. Much nicer people. And it's high quality service. That doctors don't think they're God. They say, you know, I have a degree like you, we can talk. And so there is a lot of it, and the high-tech stuff on, in particular, MRI, radiology, and so on, I actually, there's a lot of stuff, and he's right. So from the people here that are interested in the business perspective, partly because of the banking thing, there's a lot of undercapitalized human capital, cum entrepreneurial skill in Italy, which may need some friendly character that goes in and says, look, let's get a deal. You manage, I'll put you the 40 million, we need the 60 million. Let's go a bit more global than we are. I think. It ends more or less on the Apennini, follows a bit the Adriatic coast down to Pesaro, and once you get to Pescara, you're done. In case you're taking a trip, once you get to Pescara, you can turn around.
Desmond, do you want to?
No.
Okay, all right. Let's do the next question. Let's go over here.
Hello, my name is Alberto from the Embassy of Portugal, and I have two questions. In the coming European debates about reforming the Eurozone, what would be the likely position of a five-star Lega Nord movement? Because so far, in the debates between France and Germany, France has normally counted Italy as the
If you
strongest.
have two questions, they have to be extra short.
All right, so what would be the position? Would they stick to the normal France-led line in the coming debate? And also in this debate, if there is no decision, that's also a decision. And the second would be, would Italy, led by this government, accept Eidman as the next ECB president? Thank you.
What do you think?
Well, on the first question, I think the five-star movement has no clue. I mean, they wouldn't even understand the question, I think. And the Lega, for everything having to do with Europe, recently, I mean, Salvini has said something like that Italy need a strong government to be able to fight Brussels and to fight the Bundesbank. I think he meant the ECB, but he got confused between the two. So I don't think they even distinguish between the ECB and the Bundesbank, and I think Weidmann is, they probably never heard his name before.
But if Weidmann's there, then there won't be a distinction.
Right, exactly.
It would be the confirmation they're right.
So I think that they have no clue, frankly. They will learn by doing, and I have no idea, but they certainly are not sitting there thinking about these issues.
Let me be more explicit and make a forecast.
More
Here
explicit?
is my forecast. No, more explicit means it's going to be the same tradition because everything is being done by the funzionari in the ministry.
That's true. That's very true.
That's another thing that people have to understand. The reason why I think there's going to be muddling through, it's because in Italy, trust me, politicians don't make decisions. They don't have the technical ability to do it. It's the bureaucracy, the high-level bureaucracy, the treasury, the industry, the Minister of Sviluppo Economico that takes care of things. It's a closed circle of about 150 people, and that's it. So whoever they've seen in Brussels and Strasbourg and Frankfurt, they handle matter with the last 20 years, it's going to be the same people. And my forecast is that the solution to all this is going to be some figure that would look like a Berlusconi type, but would not be, some puppet that will become prime minister, and then will allow, but it will not be explicitly a Berlusconi. So somebody that Berlusconi can trust, but can be sold by Cinque Stelle as a non-Berlusconi person. I think the real problem they have is that they can't find a guy like that, or a woman like that. They're trying to find it. Once they find it, it's done, because then it's going to be centrodestra and Cinque Stelle on the only things on which they can agree, which is a little bit more of public spending, maybe a little bit lowering taxes symbolically on this and that. A lot of talking against Amazon and IKEA and all these damn foreigners and all that. That's it. And then for the rest, you're going to stay within EU and try to get by because they understand perfectly, in spite of the various pseudo-economies they have embarked, that if they get out of the euro at this point, it's a disaster and they can't do it. And given they don't have a plan B, they're just going to say, Direttore Generale del Tesoro, you go figure out what the hell they want, and then when you come back, you explain to me in Napolitanian, so I understand it.
Okay. Next question. Over there. Sorry.
Hi, my name is Leonard Campbell. Just a quick question about the quality of life adjustments that would take place, if any, were Desmond to be right and spreads were to blow out and Italy were to eventually dump the euro.
Well, Des, do you want to do your doom scenario first?
Yeah, no, that would really be not good news, not for Italy, but for the global economy as well, because leaving the euro would automatically, as Alberto has pointed out, it would mean interest rates would shoot up, they'd default on the debt. And what you've got to remember is that Italy is the world's third largest sovereign debt market. So there's $2.5 trillion of debt. Something like $1 trillion of that is held by foreigners. So it means that it would be a massive hit to the global banking system. You're really not wanting to contemplate that, and that's the reason why the Italians will try to stay in, and the Europeans, as far as they can, will try to keep them in. But as I said before, in the end, it's going to prove too costly. That we will get there eventually. It's just a question of time.
Very good.
Well, I think in addition to all the, just to go even deeper in the doomsday scenario, that in addition to all these economic issues that you briefly mentioned, I think there's an even more more darker view about Italy sort of moving away from the Western world and be attracted to Russia and Putin. I think Michele was pointing out already before how Salvini certainly has connection with the Putin area, and it's interesting that a couple of days before this horrible things happening in Syria, Salvini said that the first thing he would do if he's in office to eliminate any trade restriction against Russia. And when Putin was elected, somebody mentioned he called him. He tweeted that dear President Putin has been elected. Is that correct? Our dear President. So I'm actually quite worried about the Russian influence on European politics, from Brexit to what's happening in Italy and so forth. I think that may be in the long run the worst thing that could happen to the doomsday scenario.
Eric?
Just three things, right? In the slide of the big issues that people care about, inequality is a really big one. And I think Alberto mentioned at the start of this that a lot of the wealth in Italy is in households. That's not going to disappear if it leaves the euro. So what's going to end up happening is that anybody who doesn't own their home is suddenly going to find themselves priced out of the property market again because they're never going to get access to credit, right? When I moved to Italy at the end of the 1980s, a mortgage was 5 to 10 years, right? That's not a mortgage, that's like a credit card. And by the start of the 2000s with the euro, you got mortgages out to 15, 20, 25, even 30 years. And that's going to disappear. So that would be one thing. The other thing is that the SME sector in Italy borrows mostly on unsecured credit. So if you look through the bank details, what you find is that they're doing unsecured credit. Unsecured credit is not going to be very cheap in this future scenario, as a consequence of which what they're going to do is hunker down on auto finance like they used to do in the past, which means the growth prospects from Italy, instead of getting better because they have control over their monetary policy and competitiveness and whatnot, are going to get worse because they're going to be starved for capital at the SME sector, which is the most dynamic part of the country. Inequality, SME sector goes down, and then you have the migration issue that remains, right? They're still going to be the southernmost part of Europe, migrants are still going to come in. Those migrants are still going to try to get out, but nobody's going to let them out. So Italy's going to get bottled up with migrants just like Greece is today, and in a way that's going to make the political situation even more toxic. So when you add all these things together, in addition to the obvious legal and economic implications of leaving the euro, the fact of the matter is there's no part of Italian society that would benefit except for large estate holders who like a slave population of migrants and don't depend on small and medium-sized enterprises for their income.
Very good. Let's go right here.
On that front, and I think both Eric and Alberto, you guys mentioned some surveys out there. Even if we take that into account, that let's say we have that disaster scenario or potential for a referendum on euro departure, let's say in the coming several years, how likely would that to succeed? I mean, you have to, you really would have to be in your mid-30s to have any recollection, a reasonable recollection of an Italy with the lira. And you really have to be in your early 40s to have any adult recollection of how the lira operated. How likely would that portion of the population vote for something that they've never experienced? That it's something that their father and maybe grandfather have experienced, but in Italy that they have no recollection of.
Eric, you want to?
Yeah, I don't know. But, yes, I mean, one of the things that people, many people like to do is to, in fact, publish continuously articles, front pages of journals of the days of the lira, reminding them, that it wasn't the dream. It's become a dream. You understand what I mean? There is a projection of the so-called miracle of the 50s and 60s. So in many debates, I reminded them, look, when we were growing, the lira was strong. In fact, the big debate was that we had too strong a lira, but we grew. It's when we stopped growing, the lira became weak, and those were not good years. Those are the 70s, where we had to ship the gold to the Germans to get a loan and so on and so forth. It's not a reality thing, but I honestly, even if it's not impossible what Desmond describes, so it's a positive probability event, but it's a very low probability event. In any case, it would be Greece. It would not be getting out. It would be another Tsipras. In fact, sometimes I joke saying I like to sit just because I want to see their faces in doing the turnaround. But I don't wish it for the country, obviously. But
yeah, I would disagree, both in terms of the probability and the comparison with Greece, because the big difference, and I think that this is really very important, is that Italy is a serious economy, that Italy is 10 times the size of Greece. So the cost of bailing it out is just going to be huge. It's not going to be $100 billion or $200 billion that is going to do it. You're going to be talking about trillions of dollars, and I don't see that Germany at this stage of the game is going to have an appetite for it. So I just say that it's not going to be it's not going to be a choice that the government makes, in the sense of in advance of a crisis. It's going to be something that happens in the midst of a crisis, and that it just becomes too expensive for the partners. What the Germans tell me is that a horror without an end, it's better to have an end with horror than a horror without an end. So we might get to that point.
Desmond, let me ask you a question then. Can you describe this scenario that is happening in the middle of the crisis? Because I don't understand it. How does it work?
Well, how it works is that the Italian government would have a tough time selling its debt or rolling over the maturities, that the European Central Bank might continue. I would agree that they're not going to run off their debt, but you're going to have trouble. Italy's debt maturity isn't that long. It's like a 7-year maturity. It means that they've got very big rollovers to do. Foreigners aren't going to be too excited about doing that. So you've got a problem on the debt side. Interest rates go up. You get yourself into that cycle. The debt looks like it's more unsustainable. That's one side.
Hold it. That's a 5 days, 2 weeks thing. Why wouldn't the German be so crazy not to let Weizmann, whoever it is, say, go in? Just go in.
What do you mean go in?
Just buy, damn it. Buy it. Exactly like the Fed did.
Who buy?
The ECB.
The ECB, you can't have the ECB.
Look, the alternative is doomsday. So
you've got
why are the Germans so crazy to commit suicide?
It's not doomsday. It's a question of the Germans want to cut their losses. That what the Germans are, if you look at people like Hans-Werner Sinn, what he is concerned about is that the Germans already have a creditor position in target 2 accounts that are $900 billion. If the whole thing blows up, they left holding the bag of 1.5 trillion, 2 trillion. There's going to be a point at which you say, let's just fold, let's just give in. So that, but I wanted just to finish the thought that it's not simply that you've got $2.5 trillion of debt that you have to keep rolling over and keep that show going on. You've got something like $3 trillion in deposits that are likely to be leaving the country. So that is going to be, I think, just far too big for the Germans to take. So I think that, the notion that we're going to be a repeat of 2012, I think that that's wishful thinking.
All right.
But going back to the question, there's an interesting point about people not remembering the lira. But I think if they were, I never thought of it, it's actually very interesting. But I think if there were a referendum against the euro, it would be fought by those in favor of exiting with an anti-German rhetoric. We need to get away from Germany and free ourselves from Germany. So there wouldn't be a campaign about the lira. It would be, let's get away from Germany and we need our own thing. So not remembering the lira, I don't think would be a huge deal. But it's interesting, though.
Closing words from Eric Jones?
Yeah, no, and just very quickly, and riffing off what Alberto just said, in all the work I've done in public opinion polling, the premise that people actually answer the question you ask is the most dangerous one to start with. And that's true particularly in the context of questions about the euro, because people don't know anything about the euro. And so if you ask them, do you want to leave the euro, what you're getting actually is information about something else. So we normally use data reduction techniques to try to extract that information. And just to give you an illustration of that, in the big surveys that we did, we asked people 2 questions. How would you be in favor of leaving the euro, and would you be in favor of leaving the European Union? And many more people wanted to leave the European Union but stay in the euro. And I thought, this is like the coolest thing ever, right? But alas, what we know from Britain and what we know from the Netherlands and France and from Denmark is that if we do have a referendum like this, the referendum result will not be a function of the question.
All right, and on that note, I think we're gonna call it a day here. Sorry for that last person wanted to ask a question. All right, thank you all for coming. Please a round of applause for our wonderful panelists, and have a good night.